All right. Welcome, those of you who are here on Zoom and those of you who are watching later on YouTube. I'm Nathan Springer, and this is Psychedelically Speaking. We're running a few summer events, and we decided that it would be a cool idea to hear what some of the graduate students are working on um, who are involved in the program here. So today we have David Connell with us. He's the author of Cooking with Magic Mushrooms, the Psilocybin Cookbook, and is a graduate student in the Master of Arts in Psychedelics and Consciousness Studies program here at the University of Ottawa in the School of Psychology. With a background in psychedelic journalism, David has written extensively on psychedelic science, policy, and therapy, publishing over 120 articles and 4 in-depth guides. His research interests include psycholytic therapy, trauma-informed psychedelic care, and accessible treatment models for veterans and marginalized communities, which is, I think, what he will be speaking about today. A U.S. Air Force veteran and with firsthand experience using psychedelics to navigate PTSD and depression, he aims to contribute to both research and clinical practice in psychedelic-assisted therapy. All right, with that, I will hand things over to you, David. We'll make sure that that you're able to share your presentation, and then we can get started.
All right. Let me know when you're ready.
We're ready, so
Can you guys
let's
see my
see.
screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Um, Although we are getting that, like it says audience window. It's like a bubble right in the middle of the screen. So I don't know if you can, looks like there's an X.
That do it?
Yes. This looks good, right, guys? Yeah.
Okay. Except now I can't see my notes. So fun times. Um, Give me one moment. I am not the most technologically inclined person on the planet.
Totally okay. Yeah, and we've still got that. Yeah, perfect. Can you see what you need to see?
I can.
All right. I think we're good then.
Alrighty, cool, cool, cool. Well, hello everybody. I don't think I can do a much better introduction than the one Nathan was kind enough to give me just now, but yeah, I'm David Connell, author of Cooking with Magic, U.S. Air Force veteran, spent roughly 10 years on active duty, and 5 years in the reserves, and I have deployed to several different countries in Africa, the Middle East, and of course, Afghanistan. And today I'm presenting Battle Scars and Breakthroughs, Rethinking Psychedelic Therapy for Veterans. A couple of things we're going to be talking about today are why veteran mental health needs are different than civilian mental health needs, what psychedelic-assisted therapy offers for veterans, civilian versus veteran treatment models, clinical evidence and research gaps, unique medical and cultural considerations, uh, how we should design or orient veteran-centered psychedelic-assisted therapy, dosing strategies and integration practices, community reintegration and long-term support, policy, ethics, and the road ahead. And of course, there'll be plenty of time for questions and any sort of discussion. So let's start off with a really sobering reality. Here in the US, roughly 6,000 veterans die by suicide each year. Between 8 to 30% endure PTSD, depending on their area of service. Typically, we see higher rates of PTSD for veterans who served in Vietnam and the most recent global war on terrorism than we do in other timelines. And of course, what's also alarming is about 30% of veterans with PTSD will fail to respond to any sort of treatment. This could include SSRIs, antipsychotics, various types of therapy, and of course, typically that's also associated with some comorbid issues such as anxiety, depression, nightmares, and of course, suicidality. In Canada, statistics are a little bit harder to come by. But what I could find from Health Canada and the Canadian Department of National Defense So Canadian veterans are about 1.9 to 2.4% more likely to commit suicide than non-veterans, and they're also significantly more likely to suffer from PTSD, major depressive disorder, suicidal ideation, and substance use disorders. Of course, those statistics are terrible, but we can do something about it. And psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapy are one of those things. I've included a quote from a friend of mine who recently underwent PAT in Ecuador, and here's what he had to say. When the meds failed and the nightmares didn't stop, I had a choice. I could end it or I could try something different. I thank God every day for psilocybin. It gave me my life back. That quote came from Staff Sergeant Aldrin Zaremba, who was one of my closest friends while I was in the Air Force. For veterans, particularly combat veterans, coming home is never easy. And it makes understanding the veteran experience really important. Once we leave, we never return quite the same. And it impacts all aspects of our lives, from our relationships, friendships, how we interact with our children, to even simple things like going to the movies, attending concerts, or simply making it to work. And this is partly because veterans specifically, or particularly combat veterans, often face prolonged trauma exposure, from combat operations to the loss of friends and comrades to life and death moral decisions. And while that intensity of experiences forges really deep bonds, it's abruptly replaced with isolation when we come home. We go from spending every day with the same people, people that we are often deployed with and done really hard things with, to being alone. Some veterans are lucky, they have family, kids, maybe a few friends back home, but the things that we experience while we're in really change who we are as a person. And sometimes those changes can be very difficult for our loved ones to process when we get back. The result is a sort of transition shock that can exacerbate underlying mental health challenges and make getting better feel like a real struggle. And for some veterans, it feels impossible. And all of this can make traditional therapies, medications such as SSRIs or talk therapy, feel both foreign and invalidating. The mental health landscape for veterans is pretty complicated. We have to deal with everything, like I mentioned, from PTSD to depression to anxiety to substance use disorder. There's also issues like chronic pain from injuries and traumatic brain injury, which can be caused by blast exposure, vehicle rollovers, or other sources. Might be something as simple as someone slipped while they were on patrol and hit their head on a rock. You never know. Many veterans also have to manage multiple medications. For example, you might be on antidepressants while also on a pain reliever, while also on a sleep aid, while also on something for anxiety. All of this can interact and can reduce treatment efficacy and adherence. Conventional therapies frequently fall short when these physical and psychological issues overlap. There are also significant barriers to care. I don't know the situation in Health Canada for Health Canada, but here in the US at the Department of Veterans Affairs, you can often spend weeks waiting or months waiting for an appointment. Using myself as an example, I have to wait about 3 months in between each session with my therapist. And part of this is because the system is overburdened, along with a lot of other stuff. But all of these issues, like the long wait times, lack of specialized providers, means that many veterans never receive consistent treatment. Even those who enter the VA system, or its Health Canada alternative, report challenges navigating referrals, and there's often high dropout rates. I think here in the US, it's about 40%. That's the number of individuals that cease care completely or seek care outside the VA system. However, psychedelics are a little bit different, right? We're talking about a more holistic approach that is often removed from something like the VA. Typically, we're talking about sending guys down to retreats, healing centers, places like that. But what's interesting, and we'll get to the statistics here in a little bit, is that psychedelics are often paired with a more holistic approach to healing that doesn't just attempt to address symptoms. Instead, it treats everything from mental health problems to lack of community, self-doubt, and typically is associated with an improved quality of life and better outcomes. Now, let's start talking about how psychedelics impact the brain and how this can directly relate to the veteran experience. Most of you guys probably already know this, but I'm going to rehash a little bit of neuroscience. So, MDMA increases serotonin, dopamine, and a little bit of oxytocin levels. But really importantly for the veteran experience when we're talking about psychotherapy is it reduces fear responses and enhances trust and emotional openness. So for someone like myself, this can make talk therapy suddenly much more effective. Instead of being worried about being judged by my counselor, I can go into a session being fully open to the experience. I'm able to talk about difficult things, such as, a time in Afghanistan or something like that, without being so worried or having some sort of fear or panic response. And then when we get to psilocybin, not only does it have similar effects as far as increasing trust or reducing fear responses, but then we start talking about changes to the default mode network. This is the part of the brain that is associated with self-referential thoughts, rumination, daydreaming, things like that. Psilocybin can help with veterans in therapy by reducing how active the default mode network is, which can make pretty significant changes to how often they're thinking about combat-related or traumatic events. And then we start getting into ketamine. Ketamine is also a really interesting drug, especially when we're talking about it in a therapeutic setting. And of course, obviously, neither MDMA or ketamine are actually psychedelics, but they typically get lumped in together, so that's why we're talking about it. Ketamine is interesting because it blocks the NMDA receptors. And this can trigger a whole series of effects, but one of them is this this cascade of glutamatergic and effects and the rapid synaptogenesis. These can both dramatically reduce depressive symptoms, sometimes within hours. And each mechanism supports distinct therapeutic goals. So if we're talking about MDMA, maybe that we're trying to focus more on something like CBT, and we want the participant to be in a more malleable, more open, more trusting state of mind. Or maybe we're talking about psilocybin, and we're hoping to get them into something that is going to break down their ego and completely reset how they view both themselves and their relationship to their trauma. And of course, all of this is supported by science. Neuroimaging studies reveal that increased connectivity within emotional regulation circuits correlates with clinical improvements in PTSD and depression. And a couple of different longitudinal follow-ups indicate that changes in brain network coherence can persist weeks after a single session. For psilocybin, this can even be up to 90 days. Understanding these mechanisms helps clinicians tailor protocols and manage expectations in a way that is centered around the veteran. Unfortunately, when we're talking about psychedelic-assisted therapy, we're often talking about a more civilian-centric model that falls short in a lot of regards. Most psychedelic trials recruit participants that are pretty clean. And when I mean clean, I mean they don't have comorbid conditions. They aren't being prescribed multiple drugs. They don't have a history of traumatic brain injury along with a history of PTSD. And these civilian treatment protocols and the way the therapists are trained often overlook other things like military culture, the language we use, and how important trust is as part of our healing process. And this can lead to both mistrust and disengagement when we're talking about therapy. However, if we can build a therapy model that is kind of constructed around a veteran-focused modality, then we could make some changes. And unfortunately, veterans were just not ideal participants. We have complex needs, and they're often unaddressed. And this lack of veteran-focused care within psychedelics can really underscore, you know, the necessity of creating inclusion criteria and training designed specifically for these populations. And of course, like data shows that standard civilian trial dropout rates hover around 20%. But when we look at the dropout rates for veterans within these trials, we're typically looking at 40, sometimes even 60%, depending on how the trial has been structured. Veterans also frequently report feeling misunderstood or judged by their therapist. And there's just sort of a general feeling of distrust and a lack of understanding when it comes to veterans trying to relate to their civilian care teams. As we've discussed, combat trauma involves prolonged life-threatening experiences and moral dilemmas that are unique to military service. And this can come with something that's called moral injury. Moral injury is something that occurs when an individual has been forced to make a decision that is outside of their personal values or outside of their religious values. Let's say, for example, you have a veteran who's deployed to, I don't know, we'll just continue using Afghanistan as an example. And they're receiving fire from a building that they know has civilian occupants. And they're forced into this situation where they have to choose between saving the lives of their comrades and engaging, or putting the rest of their team at risk by leaving the building as is and by not engaging the threat. This sort of moral conundrum can cause guys really serious issues. To use an example from my recent practicum, one of the Navy SEALs we worked with while we were there had been in a situation where he essentially had to choose between stopping someone that they knew had was a suicide bomber and engaging them and potentially hitting civilian targets behind them, or not engaging and risking that individual making contact with the rest of the team. And obviously that would lead to death. So what did they have to do? They had to choose to engage. During the firefight that ensued, several civilians obviously ideally would not have been in a conflict zone, were hit. This individual carried that guilt with him for the past 15 years. And this is something that affected every aspect of his life. That guilt carried over into his relationships at home, his relationship with his wife and his kids. He eventually ended up turning to drugs and alcohol, which then caused him to become unemployed, which then caused additional stress on his relationship and his marriage. Eventually, this led to divorce, which led to him developing suicidal ideation and eventually attempting unsuccessfully to commit suicide. Veterans also carry a really intense group identity. And when we leave the service, there's this loss of purpose and loss of community. So I touched on that earlier, but to expand on the loss of purpose, typically when someone joins, they're not just joining the military because it's a job. There is a little bit of patriotism that is associated with that. And for a lot of veterans from my particular time in the service, when we were, in Afghanistan and fighting the war on terrorism, when we got out, there's this loss of that sense of mission. We don't have friends to protect anymore. We don't have, a mission to accomplish. And then you also have like a very morally ambiguous conflict. And when these guys get out, they tend to not only now feel isolated, but they start to review and relive their time in the service, right? And over the course of this, they begin to notice all of these things that they were sort of forced into doing while they were in that were morally questionable. And it can just lead to this whole cascade of negative emotions that eventually get someone to the point where particularly if they already have, PTSD, for example, they're at rock bottom. But if we sort of create a therapeutic model that's veteran centric and we can get them in care, that we can sort of start to change this. We can create effective therapy that strives to honor these distinctions and that can employ a couple of different approaches. Some that I found particularly helpful are things like cognitive behavioral therapy, integrative narrative repair, as well as peer support and a few other things. Narrative therapy in particular could be interesting and could be useful because it allows the veteran to reframe their experiences and reauthor their stories. And it's shown promise in reducing guilt and shame. Other things that can be helpful are rebuilding a sense of fellowship and shared rituals. For example, during the practicum, one thing that we made sure that we got the guys to do was journal together in pairs. We essentially use something that's called the battle buddy system when you're in it. So you have a guy you're assigned with, that's the guy you work with every day. Here's your battle buddy. You guys check in with each other, make sure that you're doing the things you need to do. We can apply this to psychedelic assisted therapy as well. Make sure you're checking in with your battle buddy. Make sure you're checking in on his mental health, making sure that they're doing their integration work, things like that. All of this can help reestablish these communal bonds that have been broken by getting out of the service. And of course, recognizing moral injury as distinct from PTSD also opens new avenues for targeted interventions and recovery trajectories. So here's a fun chart. Unfortunately, not the most technologically inclined person in the world, so some of this is cut off, but this is based off of percentages. So starting with MDMA assisted therapy on the left, going all the way over to ketamine. In the MAPS most recent phase 3 MDMA trial, 86.5% of participants experienced a clinically meaningful response, and about 71% no longer met the criteria for PTSD after just 3 MDMA assisted sessions. In Compass Pathways most recent phase 2B psilocybin study, a single 25 milligram dose produced remission in 29, might as well say 30% of patients by week 3. Meanwhile, IV ketamine infusions for treatment-resistant depression have shown a 71% response rate and about a 29% remission rate within roughly 72 hours. For veterans, yeah, Nathan.
Sorry if I missed this at the beginning of the chart, but was this like for various types of issues?
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know. Thank you.
Yeah, so MDMA assisted therapy specifically addresses PTSD. The Compass Pathways trial was looking specifically at treatment-resistant depression. And the IV ketamine that came from a meta-analysis that looked at a bunch of different stuff.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Anybody else have any other questions about efficacy while we're on this slide? Okay, cool. All right, so for veterans, many of whom contend with comorbid conditions like TBI, chronic pain, polypharmacy, these rapid and robust outcomes could translate to faster symptom relief, which means that we can keep people out of the hospital. We have less veterans that are getting to the point where they're thinking about committing suicide. So that means we have less veterans that are attempting to commit suicide. But also, these therapies are typically one or just a few sessions. Unlike things like SSRIs, antipsychotics, we don't have to keep the individual on the drug for an extended period of time. Instead, typically we'll see a few preparatory sessions, maybe 1 to 3 sessions actually using the psychedelic in conjunction with therapy, and then of course a few sessions post-treatment. And given the high dropout rates we see in traditional therapies, integrating these protocols within the VA or within Health Canada may improve both engagement retention, as well as general outcomes. Moreover, the speed of onset, particularly with both ketamine and MDMA, can be really helpful for getting people stabilized and getting them out of that sort of suicidal mindset. Here we have a couple of things. One of these is not related, but I thought you guys might enjoy the graph. Just a prevalence of PTSD and major depressive disorder among US veterans. So this 8% statistic is specifically just for 2023, whereas the major depressive disorder statistic, I believe, is for 2018 to 2022. So veterans who stand to benefit the most from psychedelic-assisted therapy are often also the ones that are screened out of clinical trials. Clinical trials really want very clean patients with very clean histories. They want a single disorder that they can easily identify and which they only have one factor to keep track of. This means that individuals who are on multiple drugs or have multiple conditions, hypertension, heart conditions, cognitive effects from TBI, or even things like TBI-related migraines and cluster headaches, which are typically diagnosed as post-traumatic headaches, are usually left off. These standard protocols exclude individuals at about a 60% rate when we're talking about veterans. Add to that, you've got traumatic brain injury, cardiovascular issues, which are particularly common among combat veterans. And you end up with a result where we have clinical data that is good, but isn't super robust. Take myself, for example. Recently, during the field work, went down to Jamaica in February. While I was there, I ended up having a seizure during our second ceremony. Well, that probably could have been avoided if TBI was included as part of our intake and our screening protocols. Unfortunately, it's not. There's a lot of things that are health issues for veterans that typically aren't screened out. And this gap has some pretty serious implications. When veterans are underscreened, you can run into additional health concerns. When veterans are overscreened, we lose really critical insights into how TBI, chronic pain, and polypharmacy interact with different psychedelic compounds. For example, I just learned recently that an anxiety medication that I'm on, hydroxyzine, which is literally just a antihistamine, can interact in some pretty, not dangerous, but pretty unpleasant ways with LSD or psilocybin. It can increase, post come down confusion, agitation during the experience, as well as tends to increase the prevalence of nightmares for individuals with PTSD after the psychedelic experience. All of these things that's all stuff that we're learning now. But as more and more veterans enter the space, we're probably going to see more individuals reporting things that aren't screened for. And of course, there are steps to address this. The VA has recently launched a couple of affiliated pilot studies, which have looser screening requirements or which account for comorbidities, and which also permit some things like, I think they're doing a study right now that's not weaning the veteran off of SSRIs before moving them on to MDMA therapy. They're also getting better about monitoring for cardiovascular issues during the trial versus just screening individuals out completely. Beyond medical criteria, meaningful veteran participation requires a co-design of research. Veteran advisory boards and peer consultation panels, which we're starting to see pop up more and more, can review study protocols. This ensures that these studies more accurately reflect both the realities of service and the lived experiences of veterans. And early data from these more collaborative models show improved recruitment rates, which means lower dropout rates, and veterans are more engaged with their therapists. This can help ensure that research is more inclusive and that we're getting better, more robust data. So risk factors in veteran-focused PAT. There's a couple of different things that you need to be aware of if you're going to be working in the space and you're specifically going to be working with veterans. Top of the list, traumatic brain injury. This is pretty important because it can heighten sensory sensitivity, increase the risk of panic attacks or disorientation during high dose sessions. PTSD itself may trigger dissociation, necessitating the development of grounding techniques and possible use of low dose approaches. This is something that's sort of a personal shoebox of mine. I really think that there is a need to revisit the psycholytic approaches that we saw in the 50s and 60s. This was essentially just the use of lower dose, sort of somewhere in between a microdose and a mini dose, in conjunction with therapy to sort of both open the participant up emotionally to the therapeutic process, but also just as a general therapeutic aid. Instead of the model we have these days where it's, a couple of high dose sessions, so the psycholytic model typically was focused on a long-term continuous care with your therapist while also using psychedelics. Anyway, so PTSD can trigger dissociation, necessitating the development of certain grounding techniques. And furthermore, we know that serotonergic psychedelics, most often LSD, are associated with a heightened risk of seizures for individuals with a history of significant head trauma. This is something that should be screened for. However, it should not be considered an exclusion criterion. Instead, it should simply be added to intake and to screening protocols. MDMA stimulant effects on heart rate and blood pressure require pretty thorough cardiovascular screening. A lot of veterans have some sort of heart problem, and they typically also have hypertension. A detailed protocol of medical review, psychological assessments, and personalized dosing plans could help mitigate these risks. Going back to my seizure incident in Jamaica, one thing that was sort of a problem was we all received relatively the same dose. This was sort of standardized across the board with a couple of minor adjustments here and there for individuals that exhibited higher tolerance. However, they did not provide individualized dosing based solely on intake and on medical records, which is where it got me where I was. Also, emergency response plans, including having on-site medical staff, clear intervention protocols, are pretty much non-negotiable when you're working with veterans. Recently had an interesting discussion with a fellow veteran who runs a veteran support circle out in Oregon. They facilitated a retreat for, I think it was about 8 individuals. And during the course of the retreat, one individual that had a really long service record and had a lot of combat experience had a moment where he dissociated and then went through a PTSD related flashback. After coming out of it, he was very agitated to the point where he decided to get a little bit confrontational and, well, not physical, but there was definitely the potential of violence with the retreat staff. The staff themselves didn't really have a way to handle this. They were mostly civilians. Thankfully, they had a military liaison with them, and they were able to de-escalate the situation. But that's a reality of working with veterans. It's something that can happen, especially for really highly traumatized individuals. And lastly, there should be comprehensive risk management that promotes participant safety and confidence in the therapeutic process from start to finish. There's also significant systemic and cultural barriers to getting veterans into psychedelic-assisted therapy. The Department of Veteran Affairs currently funds research, but does not actually provide psychedelic-assisted therapy as a covered service. And of course, up there in Canada, Health Canada will allow individuals to access psilocybin, but only for palliative care. As a result, veterans seeking treatments typically turn to third-party organizations, such as overseas clinics or healing centers. And this creates other problems such as high costs, accessibility issues, travel issues. Federal law also adds another challenge. Most classic psychedelics remain Schedule 1 substances. You might occasionally see an analog that hasn't made it onto the Schedule 1 list, but all of the big serotonergic psychedelics are on that list. This really limits clinical integration. And of course, it means that there's no reimbursement for insurance. As far as I know, there's only a handful of insurance providers here in the US that even cover ketamine. Um, Ketamine, although is sort of unique because it's the only FDA approved psychedelic, and it can be used off-label for certain psychiatric conditions. Off-label here in the US simply means that a provider can prescribe it for something that they deem is related to its original use. Beyond these regulatory hurdles, many veterans carry really deep skepticism towards alternative therapies. Part of this comes from the whole war on drug culture, and there's also a couple of other things. But there's a historical neglect around the experiences that veterans have, and this creates a sort of a stigma in mental health care um, that can sort of keep them from engaging with alternative therapies such as psychedelic assisted therapy. One way we can get around that is sort of doing what we're doing right now, where we're having a conversation about it, right? If we can educate each other about the benefits of PAT, then who knows? Maybe one day you'll be at the bar and you'll meet a vet and you'll become friends and he might have some issues. And this is something you can talk to him about. But this mistrust is compounded when clinical programs, studies, and trials fail to both acknowledge the reality of military culture and or use language that feels alien to them or that alienates them. This disconnection can discourage veterans from engaging with these potentially life-saving interventions. Addressing these systemic and cultural barriers requires a lot more than just policy change. It demands a deliberate effort to build credibility and trust. For the VA or for Health Canada, this means that we must move away from funding research that has really strict exclusion criteria and move towards funding research that is more inclusive. We can also there's also training modules that could be designed in partnership with veteran-led nonprofits that can bridge cultural gaps and model best practices. But ultimately, outreach through trusted channels such as veteran service organizations, peer facilitators, and community leaders is really the most important and the most crucial part in transforming skepticism into informed acceptance. And of course, we have to sort of develop a foundation for veteran-centered PAT. A truly veteran-centered model of psychedelic-assisted therapy begins with trauma-informed care and deep cultural competence. Clinicians must understand the military psyche and how events like guilt, loss of mission, lack of community, isolation, and moral injury can underpin PTSD symptoms. In practice, this means dedicating 2 or 3 preparatory sessions to explore service history, moral dilemmas, and expectations for the psychedelic session. It also involves creating a physical environment that feels safe, respectful, safe and respectful with decor that probably should lean away from anything that could be triggering. Of course, this is pretty normal in most psychedelic healing centers. During psychedelic assisted sessions, therapists and veteran peer guides should work side by side, offering both clinical expertise and lived experience. Peer guides, be me, are veterans who have successfully completed PATH themselves, and they could help model vulnerability and provide the language that resonates with participants. After the session, integration meetings should focus on narrative processing, identity reconstruction, and practical next steps, ensuring insights are linked to daily routines. And of course, all of this can work better by embedding veteran voices at every stage, from prep to peer support to policy and to feedback. This model could foster belonging, enhance trust, and maximize the therapeutic impact for those who have served. Group work and peer support. So this is something that I found really interesting while I was in Jamaica. Most of the guys felt more comfortable within a peer-to-peer setting or in some sort of community or group setting. Um, Group work and peer support tap into the very heart of military culture. It's what we're all about, supporting the unit. This sense of unit cohesion and shared purpose um, that carry service members through the toughest situations can really help support us when we're doing psychedelic assisted therapy. In veteran only integration circles, these are typically 6 to 8 participants in a safe, non-judgmental space. Um, it can provide them with both support and a sense of community, and more importantly, that non-judgmental space. For a lot of these guys, they struggle with talking about their experiences in the military with their providers. Oftentimes, this can relate directly to shame. There are things that I did while I was in that I really don't want to talk about to anyone but another veteran, um, mostly because I don't agree with those things. And if I looking back now, it's something that I wish I could change. And of course, for the veteran, this feels more familiar. It's like returning to to your squadron or to your unit, where everyone understands the same meanings. We all uses the same languages, and they're able to translate these abstract emotional breakthroughs into concrete lessons for daily life. Peer-supported integration has been shown to enhance treatment durability and reduce social isolation by reinforcing social bonds and normalizing intense experiences. As participants share reflections, such as, a moment where they, saw something traumatic or where they were in a life or death situation, they witness others nodding along in recognition and building this sort of um, collective therapeutic process. And of course, we come to integration, particularly integration as a lifestyle. This is one of the things that can be particularly difficult for clinicians to get uh, veterans to implement. But integration stretches, we know that integration stretches far beyond the psychedelic session itself. Uh, if we can transform these insights into daily practices, they can reinforce lasting change. This could be as simple as completing an after action report, sort of putting something like journaling into the language that veterans use. Use a simple worksheet to capture breakthroughs, emotional shifts, concrete action plans, essentially get them to do the things that they did while they were in, debrief after a mission. These sort of reflections can be reviewed in follow-up meetings, but it's really important to make sure that they're doing the work together. Again, relying on that buddy system. Also, that's important to wrap in mind-body practice, such as tactical breathing and brief guided meditations, which are taught during integration visits and then reinforced into short audio guides or recommended apps. Over time, these activities become familiar and they become sort of part of their mission-driven identity, right? And this idea that completing these is part of my objective for the day. From the clinician's perspective, this is effective. It's an effective implementation that hinges on structure, coordination, and measurement, all things that are very important to the veteran experience. So for those of us that are getting into the field and that may be becoming clinicians or who already are and are switching over or incorporating psychedelic assisted therapy, this begins by building some basic building blocks. For example, maybe you present them with a 4 to 6 week integration roadmap that includes things like checking in with their battle buddy, completing their debriefs, uh, group check-ins, finding a local veteran support group or veteran circle to join. Really what you want to do is establish multidisciplinary ways for them to incorporate the lessons learned during the psychedelic session. And lastly, I've just got few more slides, and then we'll be wrapping up. Of course, there's medical considerations. We've already sort of talked about some of these, but just I want to reiterate, veterans often have really complex medical histories that require careful coordination, both between the veteran and or the retreat or clinician. We should consider structuring intake processes to flag any history of traumatic brain injury, and then address the treatment environment accordingly. For example, if somebody's got post-traumatic headaches, you may want to dim the lights, reduce ambient noise, things like that. Building grounding techniques into high-dose protocols is also something that's pretty important given the chance of flashbacks or disorientation. And of course, should always coordinate really closely with both the veteran and with any of their prescribers to safely taper off of medications like SSRIs, benzodiazepines, or opioids. And then we get to dosing. So dosing protocols at most retreats, from what I've seen, tend to be pretty rigid. For the most part, everybody receives a dose that's sort of set out within a set range. For example, at a psilocybin retreat, it might be anywhere between 3 to 4 grams. But instead, we should think of dosing as a collaborative conversation rather than a one-size-fits-all protocol. Once a veteran has completed 2 or 3 low-dose sessions and demonstrates pretty stable integration, then maybe they're feeling more able and willing to take on a higher dose journey. Those higher dose journeys provide space for really deep insights and identity shifts, but they can also be sort of destabilizing if not handled correctly. And then, of course, I have a couple of examples of some integration frameworks that were inspired by my time in Jamaica last week. One way that I helped explain integration to one of the veterans was like this. Integration works like the growth of a tree. First, you build strong roots through preparatory work, getting to know yourself, getting to know your practitioners, or if you're a clinician, getting to know the veteran. This includes their service stories, as well as things like their intentions and teaching them grounding techniques. Once these roots are anchored, the later medicine session, the sturdy trunk, is where we create safety and trust. Of course, after the session, the branches take shape through various post-session activities that foster ongoing growth. Examples could be narrative therapy, providing a means to reframe moral injuries and reshape personal stories, while creative outlets such as art, music, or journaling offer veterans a fresh way to express their experiences. We could also incorporate somatic practices, such as movement and breath work, to help them reconnect with their mind and their body. Peer debriefs and community check-ins can serve to reinforce social support and prevent isolation, which, as we learned earlier, is one of the main factors that can underpin PTSD. For clinicians, we could structure this by mapping out a clear integration plan, including scheduled follow-ups and check-ins, providing resources such as worksheets, and coordinating with your veterans' peer support groups. And in this slide, we're going to focus on community anchoring. So the loss of community is one of the things that impacts veterans the most. It's really difficult to go from spending every day with the same 10, 20 people to spending the day by yourself. So how can we sort of extend that journey into the veteran community? Well, one way we could do it is by working with organizations like Heroic Heart Project, Veterans Seeking Treatment Solutions, and Psychedelic Passage, which offer peer-driven networks that honor service experiences in ways that clinical settings alone cannot. When veterans enter these groups, they find a space where their stories, whether it's of combat, loss, or transition, are truly understood and met with empathy rather than explanation. Peer support often begins with integration circles, where veterans share reflections about their psychedelic experience and exchange coping strategies, rebuild trust and human connection. Stepping into a mentor or co-facilitator role could help strengthen their recovery and is something that we should recommend. These shared rituals, whether a campfire gathering, a virtual meetup, or a community service event, create an ongoing series of touch points that tie therapeutic insights back into daily life. To sustain this momentum, clinicians can help veterans map out calendars of community events, such as retreats, volunteer days, storytelling nights, and that can keep them engaged. Embedding these activities into their care plan helps prevent post-session isolation and fosters resilience. Ultimately, community anchoring transforms isolated breakthroughs into a collective movement of healing. Instead of one guy having a solo psilocybin experience, now you have a community of veterans all sharing their experiences and rebuilding that lost sense of trust and brotherhood. So, what can you do? Hope you guys enjoy the graphic. I know at the time it's really US centric, but sorry. Uh, what are some things you can do? Well, one, the biggest thing is talk about it. Talk about psychedelics. Talk about them with your friends. Talk about them with your family. Talk about them with random people on the street. But especially talk about them with any veterans that you know. Support legal access. And as clinicians, one thing that we specifically can do, or future clinicians, for some of us, is we can start integrating some of the stuff we talked about into the way we design trials. Instead of excluding highly traumatized individuals who might have multiple different injuries and conditions, we can include them and account for them in our studies, which will lead to better quality data. But also, we should prioritize ethical treatment protocols, inclusion, and acknowledgement of the lived experience. This allows us to center psychedelic assisted therapy around the individual rather than just creating a one-size-fits-all protocol. Questions?
Awesome. Thank you, David. That was a great presentation.
Yeah, let me stop sharing my screen. Oh, if anybody wants my references, I have about 20 more that wouldn't fit on this slide.
All right, yeah, if you stop sharing, we'll get everyone on the screen and then we can jump into some.
Okay, I think I'm done.
Okay. David, yeah, thank you. That was an awesome presentation. It was so informative and just personal to hear it from you because I've heard at U Ottawa we've had a few like doctors who are working in the Canadian military, talking about it from like their perspective. But obviously, like, that's still kind of removed to a certain degree. So I think it was, yeah, very very awesome to hear your thoughts. And I had a question kind of pop up there at the end, and I was thinking about like the dominant psychedelic culture that exists. And there's a lot of talk about like groups and community. And I was thinking, the psychedelic culture has often, at least from my point of view, uh, characterized kind of itself as this anti-establishment kind of, or I guess the kind of that gist kind of exists. And then you have, like veterans and like the army where it comes from a very structured area. Do you think that the psychedelic culture, just as kind of this dominant, I guess, kind of abstract thing, do you think that's a bit of a barrier that we have to overcome as these kind of two groups kind of come together? And I'm just really interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yes. Short answer, yes, absolutely. Long answer, still yes, but with some added context. So one thing that I've run into quite a bit with other veterans is this feeling like they won't be accepted into the psychedelic culture. Typically due to a bunch of different reasons. Like you said, the structured part, although that's typically a lesser extent. Mostly the problem is their experience in the military, right? So if you take a guy that's been on multiple combat deployments and has done some stuff that he really isn't very happy with himself about, and you try to get him to integrate into the psychedelic community, it can be really really difficult because there's this feeling of judgment and this feeling like we don't belong here, right? But also part of the problem is that a lot of veterans are very conservative. And typically, when you think psychedelics, you don't think conservative, right? You think 1960s, 1970s, flower children, hippies running around, stuff like that, which can be sort of a turnoff for guys. What I've found, though, that is really helpful is knowing how to speak their language, right? So if you know how to talk to a veteran in terms that they are familiar with, that they understand, it's really easy to get them to sort of wrap their head around psychedelics, right? And then when we start throwing in numbers, right, we start talking about efficacy rates and outcomes and stuff like that. That's when all the lights really start going off and everything starts firing. Because that's easy to understand. A lot of guys, they may not necessarily agree with everything politically that tends to get attached with the psychedelic community. But one thing that they can get behind is they're tired of their friends dying, right? They're tired of their friends dying. They're tired of them overdosing on drugs. They're tired of them getting into accidents after they've been drinking and hurting themselves or somebody else. So yeah, if you talk to them about the numbers and you talk to them about why it works and how it can help, that's where you can really make some inroads. And that's when you can start getting guys more like integrated into the community. One thing that I found with a lot of my friends is, after they had their first psychedelic experience, they typically want to have another one. And then after they have another one, they sort of start opening themselves up to the community, right? They're like, oh, okay, well, maybe this isn't all bullshit and woo-woo and magic. Maybe there's something more to it. And once they sort of get to that point, that's when I found that they start to show some pretty significant changes personality wise. But also they start gaining a sense of community back, right? And that's one of the biggest things. It's like lack of community, lack of social networks, lack of support. Um, I feel like, the psychedelic community offers all of those things, but unless you're someone like me that got out and got adopted by hippies, starting from day one, it can be kind of hard to get guys there. Um, Sorry, does that answer the question or was I rambling?
No, totally. Thanks, David. That's honestly like your perspective. I think is invaluable because like it's just we're all here to heal, right? And I think that's I think as these things get, bigger and people get excited and there's obviously there's money and power like all of a sudden there's like people drawing lines and staking things, which is just totally again if you listen to the medicine itself, it'll often tell you like that's one of the major problems that we all face. So I think it's yeah, I totally see all the things that you were talking about, and I think that as in general, as these things kind of become quote unquote more mainstream, as we're all talking about, that there's going to be more communities kind of
Mhm.
joining on. So psychedelics it's almost going to become like a nexus point rather than the community itself. And anyways, just say thank you. I'll shut up now.
Oh, no, you're totally good. And I agree, as the community expands, you're going to have like, subcultures essentially sort of attach themselves to it. And I think that there's a lot of value there. One of the things that I hope veterans can bring into the psychedelic community is, a sort of a different perspective, one that's grounded in the realities of the unfortunate things that sometimes have to be done, um, or that are sometimes done within the world. If you get a bunch of guys that all have like a history of like shared trauma and shared experiences together, and you can get them to start sharing it, then it can really add a lot of value to the rest of the community, at least in my opinion.
I have a question. And first of all, as Reed was saying, like this was fantastic. I think over the past year, it's like, you know, we hear about the medical side of this a lot, and I think sometimes it's easy for me to tune it out because I feel like I'm hearing the same things. But today I was engaged the whole time because I was like, this is uh especially coming from your perspective and that you're kind of bridging these two worlds. Um, so that's me gushing about the presentation. Now my question had to do with the narrative kind of thing.
Mhm.
And I was just wondering if I would imagine that certainly, a lot of people joining the military, it's like you're pretty young. And
Mhm.
I'm sure that, you brought up the whole concept of moral injury and how, you start looking back at these things that you did during service and kind of like viewing them differently. And there's
Mhm.
that aspect of guilt and stuff. I guess I was wondering in this kind of like narrative construction, have you found that it is helpful for veterans to kind of look back to even their pre-military time and kind of understand like why they joined the military and why they wanted to do that versus like what their actual experience was?
Yes. So one of the really interesting things that I've found is the first thing that guys tend to address are childhood issues. That is literally for, I would say, 8 out of 10 dudes. That is, when I say dudes, I'm including all genders. Um, that is typically one of the first things that comes up. Okay, childhood trauma. Dad was a drunk. He beat up mom. Mom left. I was just home with dad. I joined the military to get away from all of it. That's typically how that goes. And then once they've addressed sort of those underlying issues, that's when they start addressing stuff that's directly related to their time in the service. And one ways that narrative therapy can help us at is it can help them sort of reframe those things, like all that stuff that they've been feeling guilty about and blaming themselves for. They can start to realize that yeah, those things happen. But they're not necessarily at fault. You can revisit things and you can help them figure out that they can forgive themselves. One thing that can be sort of an issue with guys, especially combat veterans, is survivor's guilt. You have a friend that got killed in, an IED explosion or got shot, and you made it out. So you are guilty for that. It's like, so why should my buddy get sent home in a box while I'm going home to my wife and kids? What about his wife and kids? Well, using a narrative approach, you can help them reframe that and sort of understand that them surviving isn't a bad thing. It doesn't implicate them. But anyways, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna keep thinking about the narrative approach thing. I think that's like something super applicable that I just hadn't been thinking about.
Yeah. I mean, so how does everybody think? Do you guys think in images or do you think in narratives? Like, I did this today. I did that today. I am X.
Mm.
Or
Yeah, no,
latter.
certainly like yeah, the narrative kind of you construct throughout the day.
Yeah, that's how our brains are wired. We tell stories. We're literally the only storytelling animal on the planet. So if you can get someone to change the way that they tell their own story, you can make a lot of inroads. Like using myself as an example again. Um, there's a lot of stuff that I am not particularly happy with, but I've sort of reframed it by going in and being like, okay, yeah, this is a thing that happened. This is a thing that I wish hadn't happened, but I did the best I could at the time and in the situation. Um, you know, and don't get me wrong, that's not the goal isn't to absolve someone who has committed a war crime of guilt. The goal
Yeah.
is to keep the ordinary soldier, sailor, marine, whatever, from eating a 45. That's the goal. Um,
Dave, were you just saying? Did I get that correct? That 8 out of 10 of the guys actually had a sort of a, well, let's say, pre-existent trauma before they entered the military.
yeah. And I'd have to pull a study, but most people that join the military have some sort of childhood trauma going on.
Mhm.
But yeah, that is tends to be the number one thing that comes up first is childhood stuff. And then everything else gets addressed later, which, if you're thinking about things as far as, a timeline of stories, which in my experience, when you're on psilocybin, is definitely how things can go. It makes sense, right? Like, okay, so this is sort of all the things that happened that built my persona. Like my childhood experience directly informed who I was as a teenager, which directly led me to joining the military. The military led me to doing these things, blah, blah, blah. But yeah.
Well, I can imagine that that the military can be a sort of a getaway from a lot of difficult stuff. But then still,
Absolutely.
if you the number 8 out of 10 is humongous. That says a lot about why are people motivated to get into the service.
Escape.
Hmm.
Escape. I mean, that's why I joined. My options when of course, where I grew up, literally it's a town of 300 people. There were 19 people in my graduating class for high school. The options were you either worked in the coal mine or you worked at Walmart. That was it. The one university that was nearby is 2 hours away. The community colleges all sucked. So, and I think the nearest community college is like an hour and a half away. So yeah, joining the military is often a form of escapism. It gives people an opportunity to sort of reset life on their own terms. Um, yeah.
I think in Canada, and I want to say more so even in the US, like it gives you an opportunity to step up socioeconomically.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of like from you grew up in a sort of poverty sort of affected neighborhood, and it's a great opportunity in Canada. Like,
Exactly.
so I think the US, I think you guys potentially is even greater.
Yeah, I mean, here, so you don't get healthcare, you don't get college, right? Paid for unless you join the military. You join the military, you have free healthcare for the rest of your life, and you get to go to college. Those two things are obviously a huge boost, and you get a paycheck. It's probably not the best paycheck in the world, but it's better than nothing. Um, but yeah, I'd say, and this is anecdotal, obviously, but like, during the practicum in Jamaica, I think we had one guy that his main thing that he wanted to address while he was there was trauma related to his time in the service. Everybody else was sort of loosely orbiting that. Like, okay, yeah, I'm messed up because of this, but what I really want to fix is I want to address these issues I have with my mom. I want to address these issues I have with my wife. I don't like the way I am with my kids. All of that stuff just sort of orbits around this little nucleus of trauma.
So Dave,
Okay,
so
go
a couple
ahead.
of things. Oh, go ahead, Yaron. Yeah, you
No,
go.
no, no,
You
you
go.
go.
Firstly, sorry I joined late. I thought I was in BC. I'm not, and so I am like whatever. I'm time zone challenge. Um, so apologies to start with. Sorry, I missed the first part. But I want to follow. So a couple of things. One is veterans are currently paving the way because everybody. Okay, we don't love veterans, but in the States anyway, you love your vets, right? You will forgive your vets for like a whole host of things that your hippies and whatever you won't. So vets are actually paving the way for psychedelics to be potentially less stigmatizing evil things that they really are. So we're seeing so vets are essentially, if anything, paves the way from a bipartisan, pick wherever you are on the sort of rainbow spectrum of politics, everybody supports it. Great. So we're actually seeing vets, and I think that whole sort of $50 million Texas ibogaine kind of thing is really targeted to PTSD and vets and opioid addiction, like you say, but like mostly like vets with these addictions kind of thing, right? So essentially what I'm saying is you guys are like plowing the way for other people to sort of hopefully, sneak behind and hopefully not just in a therapeutic model, right? Like hopefully more from a kind of whole of society sort of approach. So I guess my question to you is, in fact, I have a whole host of them, but like one is, it's, nobody's going to dispute sort of the need for one-on-one therapy for people with PTSD. I think from a veteran's perspective, is there an, like, can you, I don't want to say like circumvent that. Can you maybe leapfrog is the right word? In that, like, I think of like vets who, especially for people who have like combat related trauma, they're re-traumatized when they're at home in the safety and quiet and of their family or on their own. But throw them in a room with 20 other men where they're like snoring and and they have the best night's sleep, right? Like, so that whole sort of camaraderie, that like that, and I don't want to say counterintuitive because it's not counterintuitive anymore. It's like totally, yeah, you're with this group of guys you like, and it's like your resiliency is built in from a community perspective. So I guess the question I'm asking is can you see a model like, I don't know, veterans AA-esque like thing that will like touch upon a number of those things, but then also lead the way for like the rest of society essentially to post in your wake? Yeah, and what, like, I mean, you presented a whole host of different models,
Yeah.
and like, oh, this one would work, and maybe this one just be like, in terms of like that whole thing. But if you look at sort of a whole society, recognizing that veterans are going to go first, and things like ibogaine, 5-MeO, like need some hand holding one on one, more so than, and not to say that you don't necessarily need to do that, but like, tell me the model to like close your eyes and like click your heels together, and where would we be in Dave's world in 10 years from now?
Group psilocybin.
With that,
Group psilocybin therapy.
group psilocybin therapy.
Yep. Psilocybin therapy delivered in a group setting, not necessarily like a ceremonial setting, but just some sort of like comfortable group setting where you have max like 10, 15 guys together working on the issues. The group therapy model, I think, is really promising for a whole host of reasons. One, like you were saying, you get 20 dudes together, and all of a sudden, like they're talking about their time in, they're sharing war stories, they're doing all of that shit, and they're happy campers. But I think the group model is interesting for a couple of different reasons. One, so when you're in the group session, everybody else's experiences is impacting your experience, and it's amplifying the experience, right? So, you've got the music, you've got the sound of your buddy beside you sobbing his eyes out because of something that happened 10 years ago. But also, the group model introduces a whole bunch of new perspectives. Don't get me wrong, like they're all sort of samey, but at the same time, you get variations, right? Like, might have a couple of guys that lean more left. Well, maybe they're talking about to the guys that lean more right, and they start sharing sort of these common points of reference where they can all connect. I think that's one of the most promising things, like this community aspect of psychedelics, right? Like community, community, community. Obviously, there's some stuff that wouldn't really work for, like ibogaine. I don't think would work in a group session because you need to have someone like monitoring your vitals and stuff the whole time. MDMA probably also wouldn't work in group. I feel like that would get really off track really fast.
You think if you
Yeah.
were dancing in a rave?
I mean, I think that would be really cool. Like, they're obviously like we know that sort of thing has like healing potential, right? But I just don't know how effective it would be to get like 10 people together on MDMA and get them to all do the same thing at the same time.
Play Monopoly.
Right? Like, like with the group psilocybin, there's rules there that are established that are follow, and psilocybin's also slightly sedating, so you don't have a bunch of people up running around like, like they're on Molly. But yeah, I think we need to start with like a community-based model, right? I don't think that the way to go is this one-on-one or two-on-one clinical model initially, where it's like send somebody in, it's just them with the practitioner for 6 hours, and then one, it's already sort of isolating, and two, it's really fucking expensive. Oh, sorry, this is, I probably shouldn't cuss.
All good, don't worry.
Bleep it out.
We're all
But
grown-ups here.
and as far as like leading the way for everybody else, I think so, but I think it's going to really rely on one, like I said, the community aspect, but also like the veterans like being willing to talk about stuff. And that's one of the things that I've noticed is there's not always a willingness to share the experience with people outside of the immediate circle. Typically, that's probably job related. You know, a lot of these guys still have jobs with the government. They might still have their clearances. It's illegal, shit like that. Once we can get past the legal part, then it becomes a lot simpler. Um, but it's sort of weird. So, like here in the US, you're right. Veterans are sort of being propped up as like, hey, everybody, like these vets are going to commit suicide unless we help them and we want to help them, right? But when you look at how the clinical trials are designed, they're not designed with the reality of being a veteran. And I think that's where some disconnect is. It's like we want them to lead the way and to be the proverbial spear tip, but we're not designing protocols and clinical trials around them, which
Around
then
that, yeah,
causes
yeah.
a whole host of other issues, right? So let's say like we're looking at a different group. Let's survivors of sexual assault. Hey, they've got a lot of the same comorbidity issues as veterans. Polydrug use, big problem. Alcohol use, big problem. Multiple conditions, PTSD, depression, anxiety, etc. So yeah, if we can look to other groups and we can sort of take the stuff we're talking about here and apply that, be like, okay, well, if we know that survivors of sexual assault and veterans are going to be our two largest recruitment pools for these trials, why are we excluding like 70% of them from the trial?
Mm.
Did I answer your
Yeah,
question?
totally. Yeah, well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I don't know that the question actually has a legit answer in terms of like, how do we pave this forward? And part of it stemmed also too from the Santa Daime ceremony that I took in recently, which is like, okay, there's no therapeutic stuff talking there, lots of singing, but that's the community piece too, right? And that there's a glue kind of that happens there. And I mean, I want to say everybody loves veterans. They don't, clearly. Like veterans dominate your homeless population. They dominate your homeless and addiction population. They dominate your addicted population. Like clearly we are not catering to veterans. So I don't mean to be flippant with like everybody loves veterans. It's more that like, like
We like to say we love our veterans, but the reality is that is often
yeah,
just
yeah, exactly. And I think and the reality is veterans actually don't even need to talk about it, right? You can keep that in your circle. Every single veteran has family members and and so you do something with that guy and that whole circle ends up, benefiting from it. They improve too, but then they also talk about it, right? So it's that, yeah.
And one of
Cool, thanks,
the,
Dave.
of course, one of the things I did the last day, like our last group integration session is, I didn't want to give the guys a bunch of like integration tips to take home. The rest of the team had already did that. I'm there as a student anyways. So instead, what I did was I presented them with a challenge and a mission. It's like, I want you to go out and I want you to take the kindness that you've shown each other here, which is, was legit. And they had one guy, I won't say his name, but he got out of the service in some very bad circumstances. He did some stuff he wasn't supposed to do, and he got in trouble. Um, and that's like downplaying the significance of the trouble. But they were still able to bring him into their circle and into their community and show him respect and kindness while he was there, right? So my challenge was take that respect and that kindness that you've been showing to your circle here and take it outside of this, like, and it could be anything. It could be just like walking down the road and like stopping to help a homeless person, taking a little extra time to like check on one of your friends, doing something as simple as like, giving your wife a hug that wasn't asked for, which is, that's sort of a big problem with a lot of veterans is displays of affection. Those little tiny acts of kindness can make a really big deal. So yeah, that was like one of my challenges for them. Like, hey, you want to do something, you want a sense of mission again. Well, here's the mission for you. Go out and be kind.
Mm. Can you see a model where sort of when you've done your own healing, you come back in and facilitate or sit for
That's
others?
yeah. One of the things that I would like to see is I'd really like to see uh, veteran operated healing centers. You know, where you
Mhm.
get a guy that's had a bunch of issues, you get him psychedelic assisted therapy or ceremonial use or whatever, doesn't matter. Then get him trained and bring him back, right? So that now this individual who has both a lived experience as a veteran and the lived experience of using psychedelics can come into the fold and kind of help other guys out. Because it's like one thing that stood out to me. Um, most of the guys that were down there said they would not have gone if there wasn't another veteran there. They just wouldn't have. Like,
Mhm.
which is understandable. It's a bunch of people they don't know. They might have some issues that come up during the experience that could be, sort of disturbing for the other participants, stuff like that. I get it. But yeah, like I really think that there is a significant need for veterans to lead and to facilitate.
Mhm.
And I'd say,
How
oh, sorry, go ahead.
how how important is it that that actually happens in the States? Like, as in, the whole idea of, especially you guys who have done tours overseas, you're, immediately suspicious of any unfamiliar environment, blah, blah, blah. Like so in terms of whether you're doing it in Mexico or Jamaica, like you've still crossed the border.
Mhm.
Um, and how hard is that to overcome? Like my husband is like, it would never happen for him, right? Like, as in, that alone is a barrier that's like, no.
Well, so I can only answer this question sort of indirectly. So to get most of the guys to come to Jamaica, what SSF has had to do, SSF is the SEAL Future Foundation. So they work with US Navy SEALs and they pay for them to go get, psychedelics in Jamaica, Ecuador, wherever. They have a designated guy that goes with each group, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's somebody that they've done intake calls with, that they're all familiar with, that is there to basically be their teddy bear for the next 6 days. He
Mm-hmm.
takes care of if they have some sort of emergency and they need to get a hold of their wife and the kids, takes care of that. If they have something come up that's sort of work related, takes care of that. But more importantly, he knows how to speak their language.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the big things. He knows how to talk to them on their level and sort of communicate with them that way. Like, one thing that I noticed a lot of guys is their eyes sort of glaze over once we start getting into like all the woo-woo stuff, start talking about mysticism and oceanic boundlessness and all that, and you sort of get like this just unfocused look. But if you keep it grounded in their reality and in terms they understand and stuff they're familiar with, then that willingness to go out and do new things sort of grows. Um, I think that's probably the best way to go about it. I'm also sort of weird as a veteran. Like I'll go wherever and do whatever because I'm constantly seeking out novelty. But yeah, most guys, that's not the case. They move back to their hometown or some shit, like something they're comfortable with and they're familiar with. But yeah, having like a liaison or a facilitator that is also a veteran is probably going to be really helpful, especially for convincing guys to get out there and go.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think like the lead facilitator or lead clinician needs to be a veteran. Just having at least one person on the team that has that experience, if you're predominantly working with veterans, is going to be useful.
Do you guys
You?
mind if I jump in and take it in a little
Sorry.
bit different direction?
Oh, go ahead.
I was thinking again. I keep thinking back to what I alluded to earlier about this presentation I watched about, like I said, like a doctor in the Canadian Army was talking about Pat, but it was about Pat for active service members, and what he, I don't know if he was advocating for this or if he was simply communicating what was told to him. But there was talk about one on the more like moderate side someone completing a tour, undergoing
Mhm.
therapy, so they would go complete another tour, and then on the more, I guess, more extreme side, they're also talking about even bringing Pat to the active service members in
Mhm.
where they're serving. I'm just super interested, just to hear like what your thoughts are on like that. If you think it's a good idea, bad idea, counterintuitive. Yeah, it's very interested to hear.
I think it's a great idea. The only issue I see with that, well, multiple issues, but the biggest one is the military sort of sucks at preventative care, anyways, when it comes to mental health. You there, I have never been anywhere where, they've encouraged us to go see mental health before something's happened. It's always this reactive thing that happens when you get back, like you deploy, see something bad, you come back, then you get some sort of counseling. And typically it's usually just like a checklist. They ask you a bunch of questions like, are you thinking about hurting yourself or somebody else? And you say, and almost everybody says no, and then they go about their day. Um, if you can change that, if you can change the cultural stigma around seeking help, then yeah, I think it's going to be great. Otherwise, I think it's probably going to have to be like some sort of general order where you're like, hey, this is a requirement when you get back from deployment. As far as the efficacy of that goes, I think it is going to be fantastic if it gets implemented. Because you can address the issues right when somebody gets back or right before they leave instead of 10, 15 years down the road after they've already exited the service. But yeah, I think the DoD sponsored MDMA study is with active duty personnel who have had at least one deployment. Um, but I'll find out for sure and I'll let you know.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think it's such a. I think I know that DoD. Yeah, what you were talking about. I think I read about because it's fairly recent. I think that.
Yeah, like they
Yeah.
just they just finished study design, and I don't think they've actually started, they haven't started dosing or anything yet. But you're on.
Yeah, I have a I have a couple of questions around the your psycholytic approach.
Mhm.
I was wondering, maybe you said something about it, but maybe I missed it. So this psycholytic approach, is that something specifically you propose, or there's already been research with veterans and psycholytic approach?
Yeah, there's been one pilot study
Mhm.
from 2021 or 2020 that used low dose psilocybin in conjunction with therapy. Um, but yeah, that's sort of one of my personal soapboxes. I don't think it's a good idea to be giving combat veterans with really extensive trauma 4 grams of psilocybin the first time they've ever done a psychedelic.
Okay, building on that, would you propose sort of continuous lower dose, or would you build up?
Build up 1 gram. I presented on this during the other thing, the graduate student conference. But
Okay.
yeah, so in my ideal world, if I designed my own modality, you would use lower doses in conjunction with therapy at the time of dosing as
Hmm.
an on-ramp to get someone to a place where both them and the therapist are comfortable with them taking a higher dose, right? And like I think that's really important because one, it's probably going to be a lot safer. And two, you're giving the patient more control over their therapeutic process, which a lot of vets have control issues, right? Like it's, a big ask to be like, hey, go to this place you've never been with these people you've never met and do this drug that you've never done in a super high amount, right? Instead, I think it'd be a lot easier to implement and a lot more reasonable if they could just go to their regular therapist. They could get 50 micrograms of LSD or something and sit in therapy and then them and their therapist can build out a whole plan with therapeutic touch points. Um, and they can assess when they're ready, both on their own and when their therapist is like, hey, yeah, you haven't had a dissociative episode in X number of weeks. Maybe you're ready to move on to like a 3 or 4 gram dose in a controlled setting.
Okay. I understand, but another question about that is, you know, you're saying the veterans, of course, they have a sort of, complex problems, combined problems, and what you say, it's not clean, and in regular research, they would be screened out.
Mhm.
So how would you relate the psycholytic approach, or sort of gradual build up, to regular research?
Well, let me make sure I'm understanding the question. So, like, how would you relate psycholytics to like designing a study?
No, no, no. What I mean is that in regular research, of course, like you said, they're always looking for a sort of a clean image for a particular affliction, and then the approach would be to know give them a high dose. And you say don't screen the veterans out with their complexities,
Yeah,
but include them.
yep.
But in regular research, that would mean a high dose generally.
Yeah, so
So
you there would need to
you would
be
need a completely different research design.
exactly. Yeah, you need to do completely new clinical trials and studies that are designed around that approach. I believe I'll try to find the pilot study for you, but the efficacy rates were pretty good. They weren't quite as good as like the high dose model, but they had lower instances of adverse psychedelic experiences and a lower rate of suicidal ideation. That's one thing that
Mhm.
has come up a couple of times in some like the psilocybin and MDMA trials is this problem with suicidality after therapy. But yeah, like I would if Dave got to design his ideal study,
Mhm.
I wouldn't screen them out.
So, but
I
would that mean that you would mix, that you would focus your particular study design specifically on veterans, or would you mix them with other study subjects?
I think I mean I would probably mix them. I think you're going to get better data that way that's more comprehensive. Like one of my issues with the way that people are currently screened out of studies is we end up lacking a lot of important data related to how all of these different conditions interact with each other, especially like when we introduce psychedelics into it. So yeah, I wouldn't screen them out. I'd make sure that they were included, and yeah, I would have some sort of civilian population in there as well. I'd have civilians that have some sort of similar condition, whether it's PTSD from, sexual assault or just PTSD from, some sort of traumatic event. I'd make sure it was structured like that. But yeah, I would not screen them out. Like obviously, if there's some sort of severe medical condition, like if you're going to be dosing guys at week 12 with 4 grams of psilocybin, then yeah, if you've got some sort of severe hypertension or a fully blocked artery or something, then yeah, you're not going to be part of the trial. You'll die. Um, but yeah, I would include them, and you'd have to adjust the protocols to account for that, like whether that's increased monitoring or whatever. But I think by doing so, we're going to get a more comprehensive picture of how effective these drugs are for really complicated medical histories.
I understand, but there's a difference. Not screening them out is something else than designing a research project specifically focused on the veterans.
Well, yeah, so I'm not saying that you would design the study to like as if you're trying to treat all of those conditions. The primary condition would still be X, whatever that is, whether it's TBI or PTSD.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
you would just need to account for those comorbid conditions in the way that you're monitoring the participant. And that would probably mean that it has to be more individualized. But then that gets into like difficulties with study designs and like how they're
Yeah,
all sort
exactly.
of,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks.
yeah,
And thanks for the complete presentation. It was great. Thanks.
yeah, no problem, no problem. Thank you.
If we have time, if anyone has any kind of like final questions, it might make sense for one more, or if not, then maybe it makes sense to wrap up.
Yeah. Anybody else? Anything else? Hannah froze.
I almost feel like this is an anticlimactic last question, but I was just curious, that you mentioned like the other factors that push veterans away from psychedelics.
Mhm.
And then so I think I can kind of like make some assumptions about what those are, but I was wondering if there were any that might like surprise us or something, because I'm assuming that you know, you said like a lot of veterans tend to be more conservative, and I can see how that connects, and perhaps like religious beliefs or something. But is there anything like
Um,
we wouldn't expect?
Religious beliefs is one, but as far as things that you wouldn't expect, that's a good question. I would
Yeah,
say
sorry
that
to put you on the spot.
the biggest one is probably just fear.
hmm
Fear of the experience, fear of having their worldview, radically altered, fear of having their internal selves changed so significantly. That's probably one of the biggest things. Also, lack of support from their family
Mm.
and their friends. That's a pretty big one too.
Like
Several of
in
the guys,
that decision, like lack of support in relation to the psychedelic thing. Yeah.
yeah, lack of support in relation to the psychedelic thing. There were several guys um, that were like, yeah, my wife doesn't want me to be here. She thinks I'm just down here to do drugs or something, you
hmm
know. And obviously that's not the case. But I think that's one of those things that with proper education can be fixed, right? Like, oh, okay, well, let's say maybe that you have a couple of guys they're going to or retreat or something, and they're getting pushback from their spouses. Like, well, how do we handle that? Maybe we let them talk to the facilitators. Maybe we give them some sort of pamphlet, handout, ebook, something that explains exactly what's going on, why it may be effective, why it may help their the veteran, but also what it means for them. Like I think that's one thing that sort of gets overlooked when we have these conversations about veterans. It's like, okay, focus on Sergeant Snuffy and his time in the military and the stuff he did. But Sergeant Snuffy also has a wife at home that is probably struggling with a bunch of stuff. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, my husband's going to be gone for 6 days and he's going to be doing magic mushrooms. Well, he's already drinking too much. He's already using X drug too much. Now there's another drug that I have to worry about. If you could sort of explain, be like, well, that's not really the case. Um, and then relate it to them, be like, your husband is going to come home and he's going to be changed. He's going to be different, but it's going to be a good different. It's going to be a more empathetic different. It's going to be a different that has more compassion for himself and for others and has forgiven himself. And hopefully by doing so, he's going to be able to, integrate with his family better and be a better husband, spouse, father, wife, whatever.
Yeah, yeah, I wouldn't have thought of that the family issue, but that like totally makes sense. And it might even be more pronounced, I guess, in that military setting than like I'm sure that's an issue in a lot of settings, but I could see how it'd be more pronounced in that setting.
Yeah.
Um, very cool. Thank you again. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thanks,
Um,
David.
Oh, thank you guys.
I, I've got one more question.
Oh, go ahead.
Would you be would you have any knowledge of changes in attitude towards the service after PIT?
I can only use myself as an example. That'd be a really good survey question.
mhm.
But, after I used psychedelics, I had an interesting and complex relationship with my time in the service, and I still do. The way I think about it now versus then is I'm glad I served, mostly because of the people I met and because it has put me on the trajectory that I am currently. I think for a lot of guys, their relationship with the military is sort of similar. They may regret their time in and the things that they did, but they don't regret meeting the people they met
Mhm.
and sort of building those bonds. But yeah, I can't answer your question exactly, but you know what? I have intake calls with the SEALs all this week and next week. I will ask that question. I will ask every one of them, and I will email you.
Sure. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, and I wouldn't mind hearing what you find as well
Yeah,
if you.
yeah, me too. Maybe we need to follow up.
Yeah, well, so like I'm designing a whole survey and some narrative focused interview questions for a case series based off of the practicum. So yeah, I'll happily, once it's developed and once Dr. Morisano has signed off on it, I'd be more than happy to share it with you guys so you can take a look.
Yeah, well, we could probably have you come back on and do something super similar if you want to do an update.
Oh yeah,
Whatever.
that'd be
Yeah.
cool. I'd be down to do that. And then I'll get written and audio permission from the guys to share more about their stories and put something together.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. All right, I think that's a perfect spot to make cut off. Nathan, I don't know if you got any last words or anything.
No, this has been really cool. I thank you for sharing this with us, David, and especially again, like coming from your unique position, this is like very cool to
Yeah.
hear
Well,
about.
thanks for having me. I was more than happy to. I hope I didn't ramble too much.
Not
But
at
yeah,
all.
I
Mm.
really appreciate it. It's really fun.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure we'll all be in touch soon,
Yeah.
and yeah, and of course, uh, yeah, that's all I have to say. I keep feeling like I need to say more. This is awesome, and I'll see all of you guys soon.
All
All
right.
right. See y'all later.
All
Bye.
right.
All right. Bye bye.